Every morning, millions of people repeat a ritual so automatic that they hardly stop to think about what's really happening inside their own bodies. Coffee is prepared, bread is served, a piece of fruit is placed on the table. In a few minutes, the food disappears from the plate, and the feeling is that the story ended there, inside the stomach. For generations, that's exactly what we've learned. The intestine is just a long tube responsible for extracting nutrients and eliminating what the body doesn't use. But imagine discovering that, while you believe you're just digesting breakfast, an intense conversation is happening inside your body. A silent, invisible, and constant conversation. On one side, billions of nerve cells are scattered throughout the intestine. On the other, trillions of microorganisms live in perfect, or not always so perfect, coexistence with you. And between them, chemical messages travel along paths capable of reaching the brain, the immune system, and practically the entire metabolism. For decades, this idea seemed improbable. So how could an organ located so far from the head participate in processes related to mood, memory, appetite, or even how our body responds to disease? The answer began to emerge when researchers conducted experiments that challenged everything science believed it knew about the gut. In some of these studies, simply altering the community of bacteria present in the gut was enough for animals to exhibit unexpected changes in behavior, metabolism, and even how they reacted to stress. Most impressively, these results weren't confined to a single laboratory. Several research groups in different parts of the world began to find evidence of extremely sophisticated communication between the gut and the brain. This doesn't mean that bacteria control our thoughts, or that there's a simple explanation for complex emotions. Science is much more meticulous than sensational headlines often suggest. The brain remains the main command center of the body. However, today we know that it doesn't work alone. There is a permanent communication network involving nerves, hormones, immune system cells, and substances produced by the microorganisms that inhabit our gut. This discovery inaugurated one of the most fascinating areas of modern medicine. The gut ceased to be seen merely as a digestive organ and became a true center of biological communication, capable of influencing processes that go far beyond nutrient absorption. Researchers began to investigate its role in regulating energy, inflammation, immunity, and even how the body responds to daily challenges. But perhaps the most intriguing question is precisely this: how did such a small collection of microorganisms manage to completely change the way we understand the functioning of the human body? The answer begins long before modern laboratories. It spans centuries of discoveries, errors, paradigm shifts, and a long history that explains why it took us so long to realize that the gut hid much more than we imagined. For much of human history, the interior of the body was a virtually unknown territory. Without microscopes, laboratory tests, or any technology capable of revealing the invisible world of microorganisms, doctors and philosophers constructed their explanations by observing only what they could see. The intestine, naturally, seemed to fulfill a rather simple function: to receive food, extract what was useful, and eliminate the rest. This view accompanied medicine for centuries. In ancient Greece, scholars like Hippocrates already linked diet to general health. A phrase often attributed to him, "all disease begins in the gut," has become extremely popular in recent decades. However, historians point out that there is no solid evidence that this quote appears in his original texts. Still, the thinking of the time recognized that digestion and health were connected, although no one knew exactly why. For many centuries, it was believed that the organism functioned as a set of relatively independent organs. The brain thought, the heart pumped blood, the lungs breathed, and the intestine simply digested food. It seemed like a logical division, but there was a curious detail. Even before any scientific explanation existed, doctors observed that people subjected to intense fear frequently presented with diarrhea. Anxiety situations could cause abdominal pain. Strong emotions altered appetite almost instantly. Some people completely lost their appetite during difficult periods, while others sought comfort precisely in food. These phenomena had been known for thousands of years. The problem was understanding how they occurred. The answer would take a long time to appear. It was only in the 19th century that advances in anatomy allowed for a surprising discovery. Researchers identified that the intestine possessed an immense network of neurons distributed along its wall. These were not just a few nerve cells. There were hundreds of millions of them, organized into circuits capable of coordinating movements, digestive secretions, and countless functions without directly depending on orders sent by the brain. Later, this structure would be named the enteric nervous system. The discovery completely changed how scientists viewed the digestive system. The intestine possessed a kind of command center of its own. Even so, most researchers believed that its function remained limited to digestion. They still needed to find the link connecting this system to the rest of the organism. Meanwhile, another revolution was silently taking place. At the end of the 19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms were responsible for numerous infectious diseases. For the first time, bacteria came to be seen as enemies of human health. It was an understandable conclusion. At that point in history, tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid fever, and various other infections were killing millions of people. Fighting bacteria meant saving lives. Decades later, the discovery of antibiotics completely transformed medicine. Infections that were once fatal became treatable. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality dropped drastically. It was one of the greatest advances in the history of science. But while we were learning to eliminate dangerous bacteria, almost no one imagined that we coexisted daily with trillions of other bacteria that are absolutely essential for the normal functioning of the organism. In fact, the human body has never been alone. Our skin, our mouth, our nose, and especially our intestines. All these environments harbor gigantic communities of microorganisms that have evolved with us for millions of years. Today, this collection is called the microbiota. For a long time, it was believed that these microscopic inhabitants were mere passengers, living in the gut without exerting much influence on our biology. Once again, the reality was far more complex. With the advent of modern genetic sequencing techniques in the early 21st century, researchers finally managed to identify thousands of bacterial species that previously could not even be cultivated in the laboratory. What appeared before the scientists was surprising. Each person harbors a unique combination of microorganisms. No two microbiotas are identical. It changes throughout life. It is influenced by childbirth, breastfeeding, diet, environment, medication use, sleep, physical activity, and even contact with other people. Even more impressive was the discovery that these microorganisms do not remain silent. They produce vitamins. They ferment dietary fiber. They generate molecules capable of serving as fuel for intestinal cells. They continuously interact with the immune system. They produce metabolites that enter the bloodstream, and they send signals capable of reaching very distant organs. Suddenly, the gut ceased to seem like just a digestive tube. It came to be seen as a vast living ecosystem. An ecosystem made up of trillions of organisms working together with our own cells. This shift in perspective completely transformed biomedical research. But the boldest question of all remained unanswered. Were these bacteria merely accompanying the functioning of the organism, or were they capable of modifying it? For a long time, this hypothesis seemed almost absurd, until some extremely controlled experiments began to produce such unexpected results that they forced the scientific community to reconsider everything it believed it knew about the relationship between the gut and the rest of the body. It was at this moment that one of the most fascinating investigations in modern science was born. For a long time, researchers faced a seemingly impossible problem to solve: how to prove that gut bacteria actually influence the organism and were not just transients taking advantage of a favorable environment. Observing associations was not enough. People with certain diseases often presented a different microbiota. But this raised a fundamental question. Was the alteration in bacteria the cause of the problem or just a consequence of the disease? To answer this question, it would be necessary to carry out an extreme experiment. That's exactly what some laboratories decided to do. Scientists created animals known as germ-free. From birth, these animals were kept in completely sterile environments, without contact with bacteria, viruses, or fungi common in the environment. The water was sterilized, the food too. The air passed through special filters. Any object that entered this environment needed to be rigorously decontaminated. In practice, these animals grew up practically without microbiota. The initial expectation was simple. They might present some digestive difficulties. But the results surprised even the researchers themselves. The germ-free animals had an immature immune system. Some structures responsible for the body's defense were less developed than in animals with a normal microbiota. They also showed alterations in metabolism, differences in how they stored fat, and changes in nutrient absorption. Even more intriguing were the alterations observed in the brain and behavior. In different studies, these animals reacted differently to stressful situations. Some showed reduced levels of anxiety in certain tests. In other experiments, they showed exaggerated responses to specific stimuli. The results varied depending on the experimental model and the species studied, showing that the relationship was complex and far from a single explanation. Even so, one conclusion began to gain strength. The absence of microbiota profoundly altered the normal development of the organism. Still, a doubt remained: how to know if bacteria were really responsible for these differences. It was then that one of the most elegant experiments in modern biology emerged. Researchers performed a microbiota transplant. Instead of modifying genes or administering drugs, they simply transferred intestinal microorganisms from one animal to another. The results were striking. In some classic studies, naturally more timid mice received microbiota from animals with more exploratory behavior. In other experiments, the opposite occurred. After the transfer, some behavioral characteristics began to change, suggesting that the composition of the microbiota could influence responses to the environment. It is important to pause here. These studies were mainly conducted on laboratory animals. They do not mean that a specific bacterium determines a person's personality, or that a microbiota transplant can transform someone into someone braver or more anxious. Human biology is far more complex. Even so, these experiments demonstrated something extraordinary. Modifying the microbiota could produce measurable changes in different systems of the organism. Soon after came research involving metabolism. One of the best-known studies investigated two strains of mice, one with a tendency towards obesity and another naturally leaner. When the microbiota of the obese animals was transferred to germ-free animals, these accumulated more body fat than those that received microbiota from the lean animals, even when consuming similar diets. The result generated enormous interest. But again, caution was needed. This did not mean that obesity was contagious through bacteria. Body weight continues to be influenced by factors such as diet, physical activity, genetics, environment, sleep, and countless other elements. The microbiota seems to be an important piece of this puzzle, but not the only one. While these studies progressed, another discovery further broadened scientific interest. Intestinal bacteria produce thousands of chemical substances during the digestion of food, especially dietary fiber that we ourselves cannot break down. Among these substances are the so-called short-chain fatty acids, such as acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These compounds serve as an energy source for intestinal cells, help maintain the integrity of the intestinal barrier, and participate in communication with the immune system and other organs. In other words, bacteria don't just live in the gut. They work. They transform food. They produce molecules. They send signals. They constantly interact with our own cells. As these discoveries accumulated, researchers began to investigate whether something similar also happened in humans. Clinical studies began to reveal associations between microbiota alterations and various conditions, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel diseases, and some neurological and psychiatric diseases. However, in many of these cases, it is still difficult to establish a direct cause and effect relationship. This distinction is fundamental. Finding differences in the microbiota between groups of people does not automatically mean that these differences are responsible for the disease. Often, they may reflect changes caused by the clinical condition itself, diet, medications, or other factors. Therefore, the scientific community adopts a cautious stance. There is a growing consensus that the microbiota participates in numerous important physiological processes. However, many specific mechanisms are still being investigated, and several questions remain unanswered. Even with these limitations, one conclusion already seems quite solid. The gut does not function in isolation. It is part of an extremely sophisticated communication network in which human cells and microorganisms exchange information all the time. But this leads us to an even more fascinating question. If bacteria don't have a brain, how do they manage to send messages capable of influencing an organ as complex as the human brain? The answer involves nerves, hormones, molecules produced by the microbiota, and a true biological communication system that has only begun to be understood in recent decades. It is this invisible network that connects the gut to the rest of the body and has completely transformed our understanding of health. Imagine a city that never sleeps. Millions of messages circulate simultaneously. Some travel through high-speed cables, others travel through the air. There are chemical messengers, electrical signals, and emergency systems working 24 hours a day. Now imagine that this city exists inside your body. For a long time, it was believed that all orders came from the brain. Today we know that communication happens in two directions. The brain sends information to the gut, but the gut also responds continuously, influencing processes ranging from digestion to metabolism, immunity, and, under certain circumstances, aspects of behavior. This network is known as the gut-brain axis. The name sounds complicated. In practice, it represents a permanent conversation between different systems of the body. And this conversation happens through several pathways simultaneously. The first pathway, the vagus nerve. If there were a telephone line directly connecting the brain to the gut, it would be the vagus nerve. It is one of the largest nerves in the human body. Originating in the brain, it runs through the neck, crosses the chest, and reaches various organs, including the heart, lungs, and intestines. For a long time, it was thought that this communication worked mainly in one direction, the brain sending commands. Today we know that a large part of the vagus nerve fibers does exactly the opposite. They carry information from the body to the brain. This means that the brain continuously receives updates on what is happening inside the gut. It is informed about the presence of food, about the degree of intestinal distension, about signals related to satiety, and also about various molecules produced during digestion. It's a kind of real-time monitoring system, but the vagus nerve doesn't directly listen to the bacteria. It perceives changes caused by them. When the microbiota ferments dietary fiber, for example, it produces compounds that stimulate cells in the intestinal wall. These cells, in turn, release signals capable of activating nerve endings, which send information to the brain. The bacteria don't telephone the brain. They influence the environment where this conversation takes place. The second path, chemical messengers. Not all communication depends on nerve impulses. Much of it occurs through molecules that enter the bloodstream. When we consume foods rich in fiber, such as fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, oats, and whole grains, many of these fibers arrive practically intact in the large intestine. There, an invisible work begins. The bacteria ferment this material and produce substances called short-chain fatty acids. These molecules perform various functions. They help strengthen the intestinal barrier. They serve as fuel for colon cells. They participate in the regulation of energy metabolism. They influence inflammatory processes. They also appear to participate in gut-brain communication. Research suggests that these compounds can interact with receptors present in different tissues, contributing to important metabolic and immunological responses. Again, we are not talking about a single mechanism. There are hundreds of small interactions happening simultaneously. The third path, satiety and hunger hormones. Perhaps you have already felt intense hunger disappear a few minutes after starting a meal. This doesn't happen just because the stomach is filling up. The gut functions as a veritable hormone factory. As food moves through the digestive tract, specialized cells release substances such as GLP-1, PYY, and other molecules involved in the sensation of satiety. These hormones inform the brain that the body is receiving nutrients. At the same time, another hormone, ghrelin, produced mainly in the stomach, progressively decreases after eating, reducing the feeling of hunger. The microbiota seems to influence part of this process by modifying how certain nutrients are processed and how these intestinal cells respond to food. It's an indirect effect, but biologically relevant. This helps explain why different dietary patterns can produce distinct feelings of satiety, even when providing a similar amount of calories. The fourth path, the immune system. Here we find one of the most important discoveries of recent decades. About 70% of the immune system's cells are associated with the gastrointestinal tract. This doesn't mean that 70% of immunity lives in the gut, but it shows how much this organ represents a strategic area of surveillance. Every day, tons of food, molecules, and microorganisms come into contact with the intestinal wall. The body needs to quickly decide what should be tolerated and what represents a threat. It's a delicate job. If the immune system reacted against everything we ingested, we would live in a permanent state of inflammation. If it were too permissive, infections would become much more frequent. It is precisely in this balance that the microbiota plays an important role. Bacteria continuously coexist with defense cells, helping to train part of the immune responses throughout life. When this relationship remains balanced, different mechanisms contribute to maintaining the integrity of the intestinal barrier and adequate communication between immunity and metabolism. The second brain. Perhaps you've already heard the expression second brain. It's fascinating, but it needs to be understood correctly. The gut receives this nickname because it houses the enteric nervous system, an extensive network with hundreds of millions of neurons capable of coordinating digestive functions relatively independently. It controls bowel movements. It coordinates digestive secretions. It organizes local reflexes. It adapts the functioning of the digestive system according to the meal. But this doesn't mean that the gut thinks, makes conscious decisions, or replaces the brain. The nickname is a metaphor to highlight its impressive complexity. In reality, brain and gut work in partnership. Neither acts alone. When the pieces connect now, the image begins to make sense. The gut is not just a place where food passes through. It houses a gigantic community of microorganisms. It has its own nervous system. It produces hormones. It communicates with the immune system. It sends information to the brain through different pathways. And it receives in return signals related to stress, emotions, sleep, and the general state of the organism. It's a continuous communication, dynamic, bidirectional. However, there's a detail that makes this story even more interesting. If this network is so sophisticated, why does it seem to function worse in modern life? Why can seemingly common habits, like lack of sleep, living under constant stress, consuming ultra-processed foods, or repeatedly using antibiotics, alter this delicate balance? That's precisely where the investigation takes a new turn. Science has begun to realize that it's not enough to understand how the gut-brain axis works. It's also necessary to understand how our lifestyle can strengthen or weaken this communication over the years. If you went back in time just a few centuries, you would find a completely different daily life. Food was seasonal. Most meals were prepared with fresh ingredients. People walked much more. They slept more closely following the natural light cycle. Contact with nature was constant, and above all, the diet featured a huge diversity of fiber-rich vegetables. It wasn't a perfect life. Quite the opposite. There were scarcity, infections, low life expectancy, and numerous challenges. But from the point of view of the gut microbiota, that environment was very different from what we find today. In recent decades, our routines have changed at a speed never before experienced by human evolution. The industrialization of food, urbanization, the widespread use of antibiotics, increased chronic stress, and reduced dietary diversity have profoundly transformed the environment inhabited by the trillions of microorganisms that live in our gut. And they have felt this change. The food that feeds, or fails to feed the microbiota. When we think about food, we usually imagine that we are only nourishing our bodies. But there is another group being fed daily, the microbiota. Each meal also represents a meal for these microorganisms. The problem is that they depend on different nutrients than we do. A large part of the bacteria considered beneficial uses dietary fiber, present in fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, lentils, oats, seeds, and whole grains as their main source of energy. These fibers pass through a good part of the digestive system practically intact. Only when they reach the large intestine do they begin to be fermented by the microbiota. This process produces substances important for the functioning of the intestine itself and for communication with other organs. Now imagine the opposite scenario, a diet based primarily on ultra-processed products, low in fiber, and high in refined sugars and low-quality fats. In this environment, part of the microbiota loses its main fuel. The diversity of species may decrease, while other bacteria better adapted to this new context begin to occupy space. Science is still investigating all the impacts of this change, but several studies suggest that a less diverse microbiota is usually associated with worse indicators of metabolic health. This does not mean that a single food destroys the microbiota or that there is a perfect diet. What seems to matter most is the dietary pattern maintained over months and years. It is the repetition of habits that shapes this ecosystem. The silent effect of antibiotics. Few discoveries have saved as many lives as antibiotics. They remain indispensable in the treatment of numerous bacterial infections. The problem arises when they are used unnecessarily or inappropriately. Antibiotics cannot perfectly distinguish the bacteria responsible for the infection from those that naturally live in the gut. As a consequence, part of the microbiota is also affected. In most people, it gradually recovers after treatment. But research shows that some changes can persist for weeks, months, or, in specific situations, for even longer periods. That's why doctors insist so much on avoiding self-medication and using antibiotics only when truly indicated. The goal is not only to combat bacterial resistance, but also to preserve an ecosystem that plays important roles in the body. Stress that also reaches the gut. You've probably noticed that emotionally difficult situations often cause digestive symptoms. Before a job interview, during an important exam, in anticipation of worrying news, the stomach seems to shut down. The gut changes its rhythm. appetite disappears or increases. This happens because the brain also constantly communicates with the gut. When we face prolonged stress, the body releases hormones like cortisol and activates different physiological systems prepared to deal with challenges. In the short term, this response is useful. It's part of our survival. The problem arises when stress ceases to be a passing event and becomes a permanent state. Research indicates that chronic stress can influence intestinal motility, alter the permeability of the intestinal barrier under certain conditions, and indirectly modify the composition of the microbiota. Once again, it's a complex relationship. There isn't a single cause, but rather a network of reciprocal influences. The brain affects the gut, and the gut also sends signals to the brain. Insufficient sleep also changes this story. Sleep is often remembered for its importance to memory and mood, but its effects go far beyond that. During rest, numerous metabolic processes are reorganized. Hormones linked to appetite undergo adjustments. The immune system performs some of its maintenance activities. Recent research suggests that persistent changes in sleep patterns may be associated with changes in the composition of the gut microbiota and metabolism. We are still learning exactly how this interaction occurs, but one conclusion seems clear. Sleep, diet, metabolism, and microbiota are part of the same integrated system. Ignoring one of these elements inevitably affects the others. Movement also contributes to this balance. Another factor frequently observed in studies is physical activity. Physically active people tend to have a more diverse microbiota than sedentary individuals, although it is difficult to completely separate the effect of exercise from other lifestyle habits, such as diet and sleep quality. Even so, physical activity offers well-established benefits for cardiovascular, metabolic, and mental health. If, in addition, it contributes to promoting a more diverse microbiota, this may be yet another of the many mechanisms by which exercise protects the body. The great misconception of miracle solutions. When these discoveries began to gain traction in the media, promises of all kinds emerged. Probiotics capable of curing any disease. Diets that promise to completely rebuild the microbiota in a few days. Commercial tests claim to indicate exactly which bacteria each person needs. The scientific reality is far less spectacular and much more interesting. We know that the microbiota plays an important role in health. We know that lifestyle habits influence its composition. We know that there is intense communication between the gut, brain, metabolism, and immune system. But we also know that each person has a unique microbiota. What works for one individual may not produce exactly the same effect on another. This is why the main scientific societies still recommend caution with interventions that promise extraordinary results without robust evidence. The best strategy remains to strengthen what already has broad scientific support. A varied diet rich in minimally processed foods, regular physical activity, adequate sleep, stress management, and responsible use of medication. It may seem simple, but it is precisely this simplicity that science continues to confirm. After decades investigating an invisible universe, researchers have reached a surprising conclusion. There is no single magic food. There is no miracle bacterium. There is no supplement capable of replacing a set of healthy habits. The balance of the microbiota is built daily, meal after meal, night after night, choice after choice. And this leads us to the final question of this investigation. If the gut participates in such a complex network, what can we actually do, in practice, to promote this balance without falling into fads, exaggerations, or false promises? That is exactly what we will see in the next and final chapter. After going through this entire journey, perhaps the greatest discovery is not that trillions of bacteria live inside us, nor is it the fact that the gut communicates with the brain or participates in the regulation of metabolism and the immune system. The real discovery is realizing that the human body has never worked as a set of isolated parts. For a long time, we learned to imagine the organism divided into independent departments. The brain thought. The heart pumped blood. The immune system fought infections. The gut only digested food. Today, science shows a much more fascinating reality. Each of these systems communicates continuously with the others, and the gut occupies a central position in this network. This doesn't mean it controls our emotions, determines our choices, or is the origin of all diseases, as some headlines make it seem. Science doesn't support these claims. What it demonstrates, with increasingly consistent evidence, is that there is constant communication between the microbiota, the nervous system, the immune system, and metabolism. This communication influences the normal functioning of the organism and can participate in different physiological processes. This is an important difference. Participating doesn't mean controlling alone. This distinction protects science from exaggeration and brings us closer to reality. The good news is that taking care of this system doesn't depend on secret formulas. The most effective strategies continue to be, curiously, those that seem simple. The first is to seek variety in your diet. For a long time, nutrition was reduced to calorie counting. Today we know that the diversity of foods also matters. The greater the variety of fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, seeds, nuts, and whole grains throughout the week, the greater the supply of different types of fiber and bioactive compounds for the microbiota. It's not necessary to consume a single superfood. What makes the difference is consistency. The second lesson is to reduce dependence on ultra-processed foods. They can be part of the routine occasionally, but when they start to occupy the majority of the diet, they reduce the space for foods naturally rich in fiber and nutrients. Over time, this can alter the intestinal environment and affect various metabolic processes. The third is to respect sleep. Sleeping is not a luxury. It is an essential biological process. While we rest, hormones are regulated, memories are consolidated, cells are repaired, and numerous mechanisms involved in communication between the brain, gut, and immune system continue to function. The fourth is to move the body. Physical activity not only strengthens muscles and the heart, it improves insulin sensitivity, reduces the risk of various chronic diseases, contributes to mental health, and seems to favor a healthier intestinal environment when it is part of a balanced lifestyle. The fifth is perhaps the most forgotten: learning to cope with stress. Not because it is possible to completely eliminate life's difficulties, but because the body was designed to face temporary challenges, not to remain in a permanent state of alert. Small moments of rest, leisure, social interaction, contact with nature, or relaxation practices can contribute to restoring some of this physiological balance. None of these actions offer instant results. None promise miracles, but all point in the same direction as the scientific evidence accumulated to date. And perhaps there is one last reflection. For centuries, we have looked at the human body trying to find a single organ responsible for each function. Modern science shows that this division is much more diffuse. We are the result of millions of interactions happening every second. Between organs, between cells, between hormones, between neurons, and even between microscopic organisms that have coexisted with us since before our birth. Perhaps this is precisely the greatest lesson of this investigation. Taking care of your health does not mean seeking extraordinary solutions. It means respecting the extraordinary complexity of your own body. Each balanced meal, each good night's sleep, each walk, each choice repeated over the years represents a small investment in this invisible system that works silently every day to keep our bodies functioning. And although many questions remain unanswered, one certainty has already accompanied the scientific community. Understanding the gut is, increasingly, understanding the human being as a whole. If you've made it this far, congratulations. This shows that your interest goes beyond quick headlines and easy promises. Science advances precisely because curious people continue to ask questions and seek evidence-based answers. Now I'd like to know your opinion. Did you imagine that the gut participated in such a complex communication network? Share your experience in the comments. Your participation enriches the conversation and can help others reflect on the topic. If this documentary provided useful information, consider liking and sharing the video with those who also enjoy understanding the science behind health. And to follow future investigations into nutrition, metabolism, and scientific discoveries, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. In the next documentary, we will explore another topic that challenges very popular ideas about health and nutrition. Until then, keep asking questions, because many of the most important answers are still hidden where almost no one usually looks.